There is a specific kind of exhaustion that don't just sit in your muscles. It settles deep down in your spirit. It's the kind of tired that makes your blood feel like molasses and turns the rhythmic thwack-thwack of the windshield wipers into a hypnotic lullaby pulling you toward the dark. Sarah Washington had been awake for 36 straight hours. Her hands, calloused and faintly scarred from years of gripping cold metal, held tight to the massive leather steering wheel of a Peterbilt 389. She was hauling 40,000 pounds of industrial steel pipe straight through the belly of the worst winter storm to hit the West Coast in a decade. Rain was coming down in thick, violent sheets, turning the midnight stretch of the interstate into a slick, black mirror. "Come on now, Sarah," she whispered to the empty cab, her voice raspy, carrying the soulful, heavy cadence of a woman who had been carrying the world on her shoulders for far too long. "Lord knows we almost there. Just 2 more miles, don't you quit on me now." She reached blindly toward the cup holder and grabbed a styrofoam cup. The coffee inside was stone cold and tasted like burnt dirt, but she threw it back anyway. She didn't need it to taste good. She just needed the shock of it to keep her heavy eyelids from sliding shut. Her dark, bloodshot eyes darted from the road, down to the dashboard illuminated by the soft green glow of the dials. Right there, taped next to the air brake valve, was a Polaroid picture. It was her baby boy, Leo, 6 years old with his daddy's bright eyes and her stubborn chin. But in the picture, Leo wasn't running through the park or tearing up the living room. He was sitting up in a sterile white hospital bed, his small, frail chest hooked up to a terrifying web of tubes and heart monitors. Hypoplastic left heart syndrome. That was the mouthful of a curse the doctors had handed her 2 months ago. The left side of her baby's heart was failing. It couldn't pump enough blood to keep him going. He needed a highly specialized reconstructive surgery, or he wasn't going to make it to his 7th birthday. The hospital wanted $80,000. Her bottom-of-the-barrel freight insurance covered exactly half. Sarah was a 32-year-old widow. Since her husband passed 3 years ago, it had just been her and Leo against a system that didn't give a damn about a single black mother trying to make ends meet. She didn't have a trust fund. She didn't have a safety net. She didn't have nothing but a commercial driver's license, a whole lot of faith, and an absolute refusal to let her baby boy die. When the dispatcher offered an illegal, under-the-table hazard bonus for a driver crazy enough to haul this load from Seattle to L.A. straight through the storm, bypassing every mandatory rest law on the books, Sarah didn't even blink. If she got caught, they'd strip her license and she'd be ruined. But if she made it to the delivery yard by midnight, she'd get $10,000 cash. That 10 grand was the exact down payment the hospital demanded to wheel Leo into the operating room on Friday morning. So, she wasn't just driving a truck. Every rotation of those 18 massive tires against the wet asphalt was another heartbeat for her son. She was piloting a 40-ton life support machine. "I got you, baby," Sarah murmured, reaching out one trembling finger to touch the edge of the Polaroid. "Mama's bringing it home, I promise you." Through the torrential downpour, the glowing, blurry neon skyline of downtown Los Angeles finally bled through the darkness. The off-ramp was a steep, curving decline that dumped straight into a massive intersection. The rain was falling so thick it looked like static on a television screen. Sarah downshifted, the massive diesel engine roaring as she used the gears to hold back the immense, terrifying weight of the steel behind her. She kept her steel-toed boot hovering over the brake, taking it slow. 30 miles an hour, she had the green light at the bottom of the ramp. All she had to do was roll through, make one wide right turn onto the Industrial Avenue, and she was done. 5 minutes away. 5 minutes away from Leo's miracle, she blinked. It was just one blink. A microscopic betrayal by a body that had been pushed miles past its breaking point. Her eyelids slid shut, and for exactly 1 single second, the seductive, heavy velvet of sleep draped over her brain. When her eyes snapped violently open, the green light was gone. It was yellow, and in the fraction of a heartbeat it turned solid red. But it wasn't the light that made Sarah's heart stop dead in her chest. Directly in front of her massive chrome grille, less than 50 feet away, a vehicle had darted out from the cross street, trying to beat the light. It wasn't a regular sedan. It was impossibly low to the ground, wide and sleek, a pure matte black shadow cutting through the rain. The driver of the shadow, suddenly looking up and realizing a 40-ton freight train was barreling right at his driver's side door, completely panicked. He slammed on his brakes. The red taillights flared brilliantly, and the car came to a dead, horrifying stop right in the middle of Sarah's lane. No. The scream ripped out of Sarah's throat before her brain even fully processed the nightmare. She stood straight up out of the driver's seat, putting the entire weight of her body down on the air brake pedal. Hiss! The pneumatic brakes screamed in mechanical agony. All 18 tires locked up, screeching against the asphalt. But you can't argue with physics, and you sure can't argue with 40,000 pounds of steel on a flooded road. The massive truck began to hydroplane. The steering wheel violently jerked in Sarah's hands, trying to break her wrists. She fought it with everything she had, wrenching the wheel to the left, desperately trying to throw her rig into the concrete median, praying to God she would jackknife and crush herself before she killed whoever was in that car. But the heavy load of steel pipes shifted in the trailer. The momentum was a monster she couldn't tame. The truck slid relentlessly, unavoidably forward. Time seemed to stretch out, thick and agonizing. Sarah could see individual raindrops suspended in the headlights. She could see the sleek curves of the car below her. She braced for the end of her world. Crunch. The sound of the impact was biblical. It wasn't a normal fender bender. It was the sickening, high-pitched shriek of heavy industrial steel completely annihilating aerospace-grade carbon fiber. Sarah's reinforced bumper slammed directly into the rear quarter panel of the low-profile car. The sheer, terrifying force of the collision lifted the back wheels of the smaller vehicle entirely off the pavement. Glass shattered like an explosion, raining down across the wet road, while the sound of crumpling metal echoed over the thunder. The jolt threw Sarah violently forward. The seatbelt bit viciously into her collarbone, knocking the wind straight out of her lungs. The Peterbilt shuddered, groaned like a wounded beast, and finally ground to a violent halt. The intersection went dead silent. The only sound left in the world was the relentless drumming of the rain against the metal roof of her cab, and the frantic, shallow wheezing of her own breathing. Sarah hung there in the harness, her vision swimming with black spots. The harsh smell of burnt rubber and ruptured coolant flooded the cabin. Her hands were entirely paralyzed, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. "Oh, Lord, please," she choked out, a raw, primal sob tearing its way up her throat. "Please, Jesus, let him be alive. Please don't let me have killed nobody." Her whole body was vibrating with a tremor she couldn't control. She fumbled with the seatbelt buckle, her fingers numb, until it finally clicked open. She forced herself to lean forward, pressing her hands against the dash to peer through the rain-streaked windshield over the massive hood of her truck. The high beams of her rig were spotlighting the carnage. Her steel bumper had practically eaten the entire left rear side of the vehicle, folding the exotic, expensive metal in on itself like a crushed soda can. But it was only when Sarah's eyes focused on the logo stamped on the back of the crumpled car that the absolute, suffocating gravity of the situation hit her. It wasn't a Toyota. It wasn't a Benz. Sitting directly beneath the grill of her truck, bleeding engine oil into the puddles, was a Lamborghini Aventador. Sarah just stared at the golden raging bull emblem. She didn't know much about the world of the ultra-rich, but she had enough common sense to know she was looking at a machine that cost $500,000. Maybe more. Her basic liability insurance tapped out $50,000. The rest of that damage, hundreds of thousands of dollars, was going to fall squarely on her shoulders. In the span of 5 seconds, her entire life had been erased. The $10,000 bonus she risked her life for? Gone. Her commercial license? Gone. Her freedom gone. Her eyes frantically dropped to the floorboard. The impact had knocked the Polaroid loose. The picture of Leo was lying face down in the dust and the spilled coffee. The hospital wasn't going to wait. The courts were going to garnish every dime she ever made for the rest of her natural life. She wasn't just going to jail. She was going to have to look her 6-year-old boy in the eye and tell him his mama failed him. She was going to have to watch him slip away because she closed her eyes for one damn second. The grief was so heavy it felt like a physical blow to her chest. She couldn't breathe. The cabin walls felt like they were closing in to crush her. Down below on the slick asphalt, the Lamborghini's hazard lights flickered on, a mocking, rhythmic orange pulse cutting through the gloom. Then, the driver's side door of the supercar didn't swing outward. It swung straight up into the air, like the broken wing of some exotic, dark bird. A pair of impossibly expensive, polished leather dress shoes stepped out into the dirty puddle on the road. Sarah didn't try to start her truck and run. She didn't try to hide. She was a black woman who had been taking hits from the world since the day she was born. She knew you couldn't outrun a storm. You just had to stand in it. She grabbed the heavy metal handle of the cabin door, shoved it open and stepped out onto the steel running board. The freezing torrential rain hit her instantly. It soaked right through her faded denim jacket, chilling her to the bone in seconds. The wind howled through the urban canyon, whipping her hair across her face, freezing hot tears on her cheeks, before they even had a chance to fall. Sarah climbed down the metal steps, her legs feeling like dead weight. Her boots hit the flooded pavement with a heavy splash. She walked toward the front of the truck, stepping directly into the glaring beams of her own headlights, ready to look the devil in the eye and face the man who was about to end her life. The man who stepped out of the mangled supercar did not look like a victim. He looked like an executioner. Julian Vance was 40 years old, the founder of a tech conglomerate that moved billions of dollars in data before the stock market even opened each morning. He was a man who engineered every aspect of his existence with absolute, ruthless precision. He didn't do accidents, he didn't do inconveniences. And right now, standing in the torrential rain, looking at the pulverized carbon fiber of his custom $500,000 machine, his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He didn't scramble for cover from the storm. He didn't even flinch as the freezing rain instantly ruined his bespoke, charcoal gray suit. He simply stood there in the flooded intersection, his jaw clenched so tight it looked carved from granite, staring at the front bumper of the massive Peterbilt that had just violated his reality. Sarah approached him slowly. Every step she took through the puddles felt like she was wading through wet cement. Her steel-toed boots crunched over the shattered fragments of red taillight glass. "Mister," Sarah began, her voice shaking so violently she could barely form the word. She held up her trembling hands, palms out, a universal gesture of surrender. "Mister, I am so sorry. I couldn't stop the rain, the weight, I couldn't stop." Julian slowly turned his head to look at her. He didn't see a mother who had been awake for 36 hours. He didn't see the heavy, dark circles under her soulful eyes, or the way she was shivering so hard her teeth rattled. He saw a nuisance, a reckless blue-collar liability who had just destroyed his property. "You couldn't stop," Julian repeated. His voice wasn't a scream. It was worse. It was a cold, razor-sharp whisper that cut straight through the howling wind. "You were piloting 40,000 pounds of industrial steel through a downtown intersection in a monsoon, and your excuse is that you couldn't stop?" "The light. It changed so fast," Sarah stammered, the tears finally breaking loose, mixing with the rain pouring down her face. "I hit the brakes, I swear to God I did, but she just started sliding." "Save your breath for the police report," Julian snapped, dismissing her entirely. He reached into the inner pocket of his ruined suit jacket and pulled out a sleek, waterproof smartphone. His thumb flew across the screen. "Please," Sarah begged, closing the distance between them. "Please, sir, I got insurance, I got my commercial license, just don't call the cops yet. Let me give you my information." Julian stopped typing and looked at her. A cruel, mocking smile touched the corner of his lips. "Your insurance?" he scoffed, his eyes sweeping over her faded denim jacket and her battered boots. "Do you have any earthly idea what this vehicle is? This is a Lamborghini Aventador LP 784 Ultimate. It is one of 600 in the world. The paint job alone costs more than that rig you're driving. Your bottom-tier freight insurance won't even cover the cost of the exhaust pipes you just flattened." Sarah felt the blood drain entirely from her face. She felt dizzy. The neon lights from the street lamps above seemed to spin. "I'll pay for it," she said, the desperation making her voice pitch up into a frantic sob. "I swear to you, I'll work extra shifts. I'll give you every dime out of my paycheck for the rest of my life. Just please, mister. You can't let them take my license. It's the only way I can feed my boy." Julian pressed the phone to his ear, his eyes locked onto hers with absolute zero empathy. "You should have thought about your boy before you decided to blow a red light in a 40-ton death trap," Julian said, his voice dripping with venom. "I am going to have my legal team strip your commercial driver's license permanently. I'm going to sue your parent company into bankruptcy, and then I am going to sue you personally for gross negligence and reckless endangerment. By the time I'm done, you won't be legally allowed to drive a golf cart, let alone a semi-truck. Strip your license." The words hit Sarah like a physical bullet to the chest. If they took her CDL, she was dead. Leo was dead. The surgery on Friday would be canceled. The hospital would discharge him, and she would have to sit in a dark, empty apartment and watch her 6-year-old son slowly suffocate as his heart gave out. The profound, astronomical weight of her failure finally broke her. Sarah's legs simply stopped working. Her knees buckled. She collapsed right there in the middle of the flooded street. The filthy, freezing water soaked through her jeans. She knelt in the puddle, surrounded by the shattered glass of the billionaire's toy, and she bowed her head. "I ain't got nothing," Sarah screamed, the raw, agonizing sound of a mother's broken heart tearing out of her throat. She slammed her calloused hands down into the puddle, splashing water onto Julian's polished shoes. "Take my life, take it. But you can't take my license. My baby is dying. He's dying in a hospital bed right now, and I need the money for his heart. Please, Jesus, please have some mercy." She was sobbing so hard she was choking on the rain, her forehead nearly touching the asphalt. She had completely stripped away every ounce of her pride. She was begging a stranger for the life of her child. Julian stared down at her. For a split second, a flicker of something crossed his eyes. A brief, uncomfortable realization of the sheer, terrifying depth of human suffering kneeling at his feet. But he quickly hardened his jaw. He had built his empire by ignoring sob stories. "Operator," Julian spoke into the phone, turning his back on Sarah's kneeling figure. "Yes, I need police and a flatbed tow immediately at the intersection of 5th and Alameda. A commercial truck just rear-ended my vehicle. No, I am unharmed, but the driver is erratic." Sarah knelt in the water, her eyes squeezed shut, listening to the man systematically dismantle her entire existence. In the distance, cutting through the thunder, the faint, high-pitched wail of police sirens began to rise. "It's over," Sarah thought, the darkness completely swallowing her soul. "I'm so sorry, Leo. Mama failed you." But then another sound pierced the night. It wasn't the sirens. It wasn't the thunder. It was a scream. It came from inside the crushed Lamborghini. It wasn't the cry of someone who was physically injured. It was a high-pitched, guttural, blood-curdling shriek of absolute, primal terror. It was the sound of a human mind shattering into a million pieces. Julian froze. The phone slipped from his fingers, splashing into the puddle at his feet. "Chloe," he gasped, the color instantly draining from his face. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire vanished in a millisecond. In his place was a father who had just been struck by lightning. Julian spun around and lunged toward the passenger side of the supercar. Because of the impact from the truck, the chassis was warped. The iconic scissor door was jammed. "Chloe, sweetheart, Daddy's here," Julian yelled, grabbing the handle and pulling with all of his strength. The metal groaned, but the door wouldn't budge. Inside the cabin, illuminated by the dashboard lights, Sarah could see the passenger. It was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 8. She was wearing a pink raincoat, but she had thrown her hood back. The child was in the middle of a catastrophic panic attack. She had pulled her knees up to her chest, pressing herself as hard as she could into the corner of the leather seat. Her hands were clamped fiercely over her ears, her eyes squeezed tightly shut. She was thrashing her head violently from side to side, screaming nonstop, a deafening rhythmic shrieking that tore through the glass. The sudden, violent jolt of the crash, the sound of crunching metal. The feeling of being trapped inside a dark, confined space while the rain hammered against the roof. It was a perfect, horrifying storm of psychological triggers. "Chloe, look at me, look at Daddy!" Julian screamed, frantically pounding his fist against the tempered glass of the passenger window. He was losing his mind. He pulled back his elbow and slammed it into the glass, trying to break it, but the reinforced window didn't even crack. The little girl couldn't hear him. She was entirely lost in her own terrifying reality. She began to hyperventilate, her small chest heaving violently, gasping for air that she couldn't seem to swallow. Her face was turning a dangerous shade of pale. "She can't breathe," Julian yelled, sheer panic stripping away every ounce of his composure. He ran around to the driver's side, diving into the open door, reaching across the center console to grab his daughter's shoulder. "Chloe, baby, it's okay, we're not trapped, you're safe," Julian pleaded, trying to pull her hands away from her ears. But the moment he touched her, the little girl shrieked even louder, violently thrashing her arms and kicking her feet against the dashboard. She was completely disconnected from the present moment. In her mind, she wasn't in a car accident in Los Angeles. She was back in the darkness. She was back in the nightmare. "Stop it, let me out, it's falling, the roof is falling." Chloe screamed, her voice cracking, coughing violently as she struggled to draw oxygen into her panicked lungs. Julian was completely helpless. He was a man who could solve any problem by throwing millions of dollars at it, but right now, all of his wealth, all of his power, and all of his influence were utterly useless. He couldn't buy his daughter's way out of her own mind. He was watching his child hyperventilate to the point of passing out, and he had absolutely no idea how to stop it. Sarah was still kneeling in the puddle. The rain was beating down on her back. Her world was completely destroyed. She was facing jail time and the loss of her son. The man screaming in the car was the man who had just sentenced her to hell. She should have hated him. She should have let him suffer. But Sarah Washington wasn't a billionaire. She didn't view the world in terms of assets and liabilities. She was a mother. And the sound of a terrified, suffocating child bypassed every single logical thought in her brain, striking directly at the core of her soul. The exhaustion evaporated. The fear of the police vanished. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes locked onto the thrashing little girl inside the supercar. She recognized that kind of panic. She had spent countless nights in the ICU holding Leo down when the monitors beeped too loud and the terrifying reality of the hospital walls closed in on him. She knew what it looked like when a child's spirit was trying to escape its own body. Sarah pushed herself up from the flooded asphalt. She wiped the dirty rainwater from her eyes. She didn't look like a defeated, broken truck driver anymore, her jaw set. Her posture straightened. She moved with the sudden fierce and undeniable authority of a mother, stepping onto a battlefield. Julian was still leaning across the center console, frantically shaking his daughter's shoulders, his voice cracking in desperation. "Chloe, please, breathe. You have to breathe." Sarah walked right up to the open driver's side door of the Lamborghini. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't hesitate. She reached her calloused hand into the cabin, grabbed the soaking wet shoulder of the billionaire's tailored suit, and yanked him backward with a strength born of pure adrenaline. The physical force of Sarah's grip was startling. She didn't just tug at Julian's tailored sleeve. She grabbed a fistful of his soaked $1,000 suit jacket and hauled him backward with the raw, unyielding strength of a woman who wrestled 40-ton rigs for a living. Julian stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping on the wet asphalt. He caught his balance just before falling into a puddle, his face instantly contorting into a mask of pure, aristocratic outrage. "What the hell are you doing?" Julian roared, his voice echoing over the thunder. The sheer audacity of this woman, this reckless, destitute truck driver who had just destroyed his property, putting her hands on him was completely incomprehensible. "Don't you ever touch me. That is my daughter in there." He lunged forward to get back into the car, his fists clenched, ready to physically throw Sarah out of his way. But Sarah didn't back down. She didn't cower. She didn't apologize. She turned on her heel and stepped squarely into his path, blocking the open door of the supercar with her own body. She planted her steel-toed boots wide on the pavement. She looked the furious billionaire dead in the eye, and the terrified, begging woman from 2 minutes ago was entirely gone. In her place stood a mother. And a mother defending a child in pain possesses an authority that no amount of money in the world can buy. "You are suffocating her," Sarah shouted back, her voice carrying a deep, resonant boom that stopped Julian dead in his tracks. "Look at her. You screaming in her face and shaking her is only driving the panic deeper. You ain't grounding her, you're drowning her." "I am trying to help her," Julian yelled, the veins in his neck bulging. "She has a medical condition." "You don't know what you're dealing with." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Sarah shot back, her dark eyes flashing with a fierce, uncompromising fire. "I spent half my boy's life in the ICU pulling him out of night terrors. When a child's mind fractures like that, they don't hear your words. They only feel your energy, and right now your energy is purely frantic. You are feeding the monster in her head. Now you need to shut your mouth, step back, and let me work." For a second, Julian Vance, the titan of Silicon Valley, the man who made board of directors tremble, was completely paralyzed. He was entirely disarmed by the sheer, overwhelming force of her command. It wasn't disrespect, it was an absolute, unshakable maternal mandate. He looked past Sarah, into the cabin. Chloe was still thrashing wildly, her face a terrifying shade of pale as she hyperventilated, her tiny fingers clawing at the leather seats as if she were trying to dig her way out of a grave. Julian's shoulders slumped. The anger evaporated, leaving only the agonizing helplessness of a father watching his child suffer. He took a slow, trembling step backward, raising his hands in a gesture of defeat. Sarah didn't wait to see if he would stay put. She immediately pivoted away from the open driver's door. She knew better than to lean into the confined, dark space of the car from that angle. A child in a severe panic attack needed space, not a stranger looming over them in the shadows. She walked quickly around the crushed rear of the Lamborghini, her boots splashing through the water, ignoring the jagged pieces of carbon fiber and shattered taillights cutting into the soles of her shoes. She went straight to the jammed passenger side door. The tempered glass of the passenger window was miraculously still intact, though spider-webbed with tiny fractures from the impact. Through the wet, rain-streaked glass, Sarah could see Chloe pressed into the corner, her hands clamped over her ears, her eyes squeezed tightly shut against a horror that only she could see. She thinks she's trapped, Sarah thought, recognizing the specific nature of the physical thrashing. She thinks the world is falling down on her. I gotta bring her back to the ground. I gotta give her an anchor. Sarah dropped to her knees right there in the flooded street. She didn't care about the freezing water seeping through her jeans. She didn't care about the police sirens growing louder in the distance. The entire universe narrowed down to the little girl on the other side of the glass. Sarah leaned in, pressing her wet face close to the cold window so she would be the very first thing Chloe saw when she finally opened her eyes. Then, Sarah raised her right hand. She didn't pound on the glass, she didn't shout. Instead, she curled her calloused fingers into a loose fist and began to tap against the glass. Thump, thump, thump. It was a slow, steady, deliberate rhythm, the exact tempo of a calm, resting human heartbeat. 60 beats a minute. Over the howling wind and the drumming rain, the deep, rhythmic vibration of Sarah's knuckles on the glass transferred into the cabin of the car. It was a grounding technique, a physical metronome designed to cut through the chaotic noise inside the child's brain. Thump, thump, thump. Inside the car, Chloe's thrashing paused for a microsecond. The rhythmic vibration against the door panel had registered. Sarah saw the slight shift in the girl's posture. It was time. She leaned her forehead against the freezing glass. She closed her eyes for a moment, pulling up a melody from the deepest, oldest part of her soul. It was a song her own grandmother used to sing to her during the terrifying, rattling thunderstorms in Louisiana. It was the exact same song she sang to her son Leo every time the hospital machines beeped too loud and the sterile white walls started closing in on him. It wasn't a nursery rhyme, it was a spiritual. It was a song built from the soil, thick with resilience, designed to wrap around a frightened spirit like a heavy, warm quilt. Sarah took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill her lungs, and she began to sing. Her voice was an absolute revelation. It wasn't a whisper. It was a rich, deep, velvet hum that seemed to vibrate straight from her chest, cutting effortlessly through the torrential noise of the storm. Hush now, little bird, don't you cry. The melody was slow, soulful, and hauntingly beautiful. It carried the weight of 100 generations of mothers soothing their children in the dark. Sun's gone down, but the moon's up high. Shadows are long, but the dark ain't deep. Close your eyes and just go to sleep. Sarah kept tapping the steady heartbeat rhythm on the glass. Thump, 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 thump. I got you safe, I got you tight. Ain't nothing gonna hurt you in the middle of the night. Inside the mangled Lamborghini, the transformation was almost supernatural. The moment the muffled, deep resonance of Sarah's voice penetrated the shattered glass, Chloe's entire body went completely rigid. The deafening, blood-curdling shrieks stopped instantly. The hyperventilation hitched, catching in her throat, and then slowly began to smooth out into deep, ragged gasps. It was as if an invisible, heavy blanket had just been dropped over the fire in her brain. Chloe slowly, tentatively lowered her hands from her ears. The river is wide, the water is cold, but Mama's right here, and you're brave and bold. Sarah didn't stop singing. She kept her eyes locked on the little girl, pouring every ounce of her maternal soul into the melody, willing her strength through the glass. Chloe's head slowly turned. Her eyes, red and swollen from crying, fluttered open. Through the rain streaming down the window, the little girl saw the face of the black woman kneeling in the water. She saw the tired, soulful eyes. She heard the deep rhythmic hum of the voice. It wasn't just a song. To Chloe, it was the song. 5 years ago, in the suffocating, crushing darkness of a collapsed highway tunnel, when she was just 3 years old and convinced she was going to die beneath a mountain of concrete, that exact voice had found her. That exact voice had wrapped around her in the pitch black, holding her hand, singing that exact melody for 2 agonizing hours until the rescue teams broke through. Chloe had never seen the face of her savior. The tunnel had been too dark, but a child never, ever forgets the voice that pulls them out of hell. The lady in the dark, Chloe whispered, her voice a tiny awestruck squeak. I got you safe, I got you tight. Sarah finished the verse, a warm, reassuring smile spreading across her wet face. She stopped tapping the glass and pressed her open palm flat against the window. You're okay, baby. Look at me. You're right here. You're safe. Chloe didn't look at the crushed metal around her. She didn't look at the flashing hazard lights. She only looked at Sarah. With a slow, trembling movement, The 8-year-old girl uncurled herself from the tight ball in the corner of the seat. She crawled over the expensive leather, moving closer to the jammed door. She raised her tiny, pale hand and pressed it flat against the inside of the glass, perfectly aligning her small fingers with Sarah's larger, calloused hand on the outside. Sarah smiled, the tears of relief mingling with the rain on her cheeks. "There you go, little bird," she whispered softly through the crack in the window. "I got you." The panic attack was entirely broken. The storm inside the car had been completely silenced. On the other side of the vehicle, standing in the pouring rain, Julian Vance was completely frozen. He had walked around the back of the car, intending to intervene, intending to pull this crazy truck driver away from his daughter. But he hadn't made it. He was standing 5 feet away, staring at the scene unfolding in front of him. The smartphone he had dropped was long forgotten in the puddle. His expensive suit was clinging to his shivering frame. He had heard the song. He had heard the deep, soulful, haunting melody rising over the sound of the rain. "Hush now, little bird, don't you cry." Julian felt the breath completely leave his lungs. It felt as if the heavy steel bumper of the Peterbilt had just struck him directly in the chest. For 5 years, his daughter had suffered from crippling night terrors. For 5 years, the top child psychologists in the world had tried to treat her. And for 5 years, Chloe had told them all the same thing. "I just want to hear the song. I want the lady in the dark to sing the bird's song." Julian had hired private investigators. He had spent millions of dollars trying to track down the anonymous woman who had crawled into that unstable, collapsing tunnel to save his little girl when the paramedics refused to risk it. He had wanted to give her the world, but the woman had vanished from the triage tent before anyone could get her name. And now, standing in the freezing rain of downtown Los Angeles, the ghost from the tunnel had materialized right in front of him. The woman who had just rear-ended his $500,000 supercar. The woman he had just brutally verbally abused, threatened to ruin, and sentenced to a life of inescapable poverty. The woman who had knelt in the mud and begged him for the life of her dying son. That woman was the savior he had spent 5 years hunting for. Julian stared at the 2 hands pressed together through the glass. One small and frail, the other scarred and calloused. A profound, terrifying wave of realization crashed over him. The absolute arrogance of his wealth, the cruelty of his anger, the monstrous way he had just treated this exhausted mother, it all hit him with the force of a wrecking ball. The flashing red and blue lights of the LAPD cruisers finally cut through the darkness, pulling into the intersection, their sirens blaring as they surrounded the wreckage. But Julian didn't look at the police. He didn't look at his destroyed Lamborghini. He could only stare at the woman kneeling in the water, realizing with absolute horrifying clarity that he had just tried to destroy the one human being on Earth who had saved his entire world. The human brain is a marvel of compartmentalization. It can lock away the most agonizing, terrifying memories in heavily fortified vaults, allowing a person to continue functioning, building empires and acquiring wealth. But when the right key is turned, a specific scent, a sudden drop in temperature, or the exact cadence of a forgotten melody, those vaults do not just open. They explode. "Hush now, little bird, don't you cry." Julian Vance stood in the freezing Los Angeles downpour, but he didn't feel the rain anymore. The howling wind, the rhythmic flashing of the Lamborghini's hazard lights, and the approaching wail of the police sirens all faded into a muffled, distant static. The world around him dissolved, completely washed away by the deep, soulful vibration of the woman's voice. He was no longer a 40-year-old billionaire standing in an intersection. He was 35 again, and he was in hell, 5 years ago. The memory hit Julian with the visceral, bone-crushing force of a physical blow. The cold, wet air of the city suddenly turned into the suffocating, chalky heat of pulverized concrete and ruptured asphalt. It was the Interstate 5 tunnel collapse. A localized, catastrophic structural failure had brought thousands of tons of steel and concrete crashing down onto the afternoon gridlock. Julian had been driving his previous car, a reinforced armored SUV, with 3-year-old Chloe strapped into her car seat in the back. When the ceiling gave way, the impact had been apocalyptic. The front half of the SUV was completely sheared off. Julian had been violently ejected through the shattered windshield, thrown clear of the immediate crush zone, landing on the dark, dust-choked pavement with a severe concussion and 3 broken ribs. But Chloe hadn't been thrown clear. Julian's memory dragged him back to the agonizing moment he regained consciousness. The tunnel was pitch black, illuminated only by the erratic, sweeping beams of emergency flashlights, and the terrifying orange glow of a localized electrical fire. The air was thick with the toxic smell of aerosolized dust and leaking gasoline. "Chloe!" he had screamed, spitting blood onto the pavement, trying to crawl back toward the wreckage. Two burly paramedics had grabbed him by the shoulders, violently pinning him to the ground. "Hold him down, sir, you cannot go back there." One of the medics had yelled over the deafening groan of shifting concrete. Julian had fought them with the frantic, feral strength of a dying animal. He looked toward his vehicle. A massive 50-ton slab of the tunnel's roof had pancaked the rear half of the SUV. The vehicle was compressed into a jagged, unrecognizable metal coffin, buried under a mountain of rebar and debris. "My daughter is in there. Let me go. I'll give you $1 million, I'll give you 10 million, just get her out." Julian had shrieked, coughing up dust. The fire captain had run over, his face grim, smeared with soot. "Mr. Vance, the structure is completely compromised. There's a ruptured gas main directly beneath that slab. One spark, one wrong shift of the debris, and this entire section goes up. It's a suicide mission. My men cannot fit through that gap without the jaws of life, and the heavy machinery is an hour away." "She doesn't have an hour." Julian had sobbed, the absolute terrifying impotence of his wealth crushing him. He could buy entire corporations with a single phone call, but in that dark tunnel, his billions were utterly worthless. He couldn't buy a miracle. He couldn't buy bravery, and then, out of the chaotic, screaming shadows of the disaster, she had appeared. She wasn't a first responder. She was just a civilian. A woman wearing a reflective trucking vest, her face obscured by a thick layer of gray concrete dust, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. She had abandoned her own rig further down the tunnel and ran toward the epicenter of the collapse. "There's a baby in there," she had yelled, shoving past the police barricade. The fire captain tried to grab her. "Ma'am, get back. The structure is collapsed. Take your hands off me. That baby is crying." The woman had roared, a voice so full of raw, unyielding authority that the veteran firefighters actually stepped back. Without asking for a reward, without a moment of hesitation, the woman dropped to her stomach. She shined a small penlight into the jagged, terrifyingly narrow crevice of the crushed SUV, a space lined with razor-sharp metal and leaking fuel. Julian had watched in absolute awe and terror as the woman wriggled her way into the metal coffin, disappearing entirely into the darkness under the 50-ton slab. For 10 agonizing minutes, there was nothing but the terrifying groans of the shifting concrete. Julian's heart had stopped. The fire captain was screaming into his radio, expecting the entire pile to explode. Then a sound emerged from the darkness. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a cry for help, it was a song. "Hush now, little bird, don't you cry. Sun's gone down but the moon's up high." The deep, soulful, unwavering melody echoed out of the crushed metal. The woman had found Chloe. She couldn't pull the 3-year-old out. Her leg was pinned, so the stranger had simply wrapped her body around the child, shielding her from the falling debris, and began to sing. For 2 hours, while the rescue teams frantically worked to stabilize the roof and bring in the heavy cutters, that woman did not stop singing. She sang through the tremors. She sang through the smell of gasoline. She sang to keep a terrified 3-year-old girl tethered to the world of the living, preventing her from slipping into a fatal shock. When the hydraulic cutters finally pried the roof open and pulled Chloe out, she was clutching a torn piece of a reflective vest. Julian had grabbed his daughter, weeping uncontrollably as the medics rushed them to the waiting ambulances. In the chaotic aftermath, Julian had turned around, desperately searching the triage tents for the woman. He wanted to give her half his empire. He wanted to build monuments to her name, but she was gone. She had quietly slipped away into the crowd of evacuated drivers, leaving no name, no contact information. She hadn't stayed for the cameras. She hadn't stayed for a reward. For 5 years she was just the ghost in the tunnel, the anonymous savior who had preserved Julian's universe. Present day. Julian gasped, the cold Los Angeles rain violently pulling him back to reality. His chest heaved. The phantom smell of gasoline and concrete dust vanished, replaced by the scent of wet asphalt and ruptured engine coolant. He stared at the woman kneeling beside his crushed Lamborghini, Sarah Washington. She was still pressing her hand against the glass, her dark, tired eyes filled with an infinite maternal tenderness as she looked at Chloe. The melody was still humming from her lips, soothing the broken pieces of his daughter's mind, just as it had done in the dark rubble 5 years ago. Julian's knees felt weak. The absolute, staggering gravity of the universe's irony crashed down upon his shoulders, threatening to crush him far worse than any falling concrete ever could. I found her, he thought, his mind reeling in sheer disbelief. After 5 years and millions of dollars spent on private investigators. She ran right into me, but the awe of the miraculous reunion was instantly, violently eclipsed by a wave of nausea. Julian remembered what he had just done. He looked at Sarah's faded, soaked denim jacket. He looked at her battered, cheap work boots. He remembered the dark circles under her eyes, the desperate way she had collapsed to her knees in the filthy puddle. I ain't got nothing. Take my life, but you can't take my license. My baby is dying in a hospital bed right now. The words echoed in Julian's mind, but this time they didn't sound like the annoying excuses of a reckless liability. They sounded like the agonizing cries of an angel whose wings had been broken by a cruel, unforgiving world. While he had spent the last 5 years sleeping in climate-controlled mansions, flying on private jets, and building an empire of silicon and data, the woman who had saved his daughter's life had been out here in the dark. She had been grinding herself to the bone, driving 36-hour shifts, destroying her own body just to keep her sick child alive. And when destiny finally brought them together, what had Julian done? He had stood over her like a tyrant. He had looked at the woman who had crawled into a collapsing tunnel for him, and he had sneered at her poverty. He had threatened to strip her license. He had promised to sue her into oblivion. He had effectively looked this desperate, weeping mother in the eye and told her he was going to let her son die over a scratched piece of Italian metal. My God, Julian thought, a profound, sickening horror wrapping around his throat. What have I become? I am a monster. The ego of the billionaire CEO. The armor of arrogance and superiority he had worn for decades, completely shattered into dust washed away by the freezing rain. He felt a sting behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the burning, agonizing sting of total, absolute shame. Hoop! Hoop! The short, aggressive chirp of a police siren jerked Julian's attention away from the car. 2 LAPD cruisers had forcefully angled their way into the intersection, their high beams cutting through the storm, boxings in the massive Peterbilt truck and the crushed Lamborghini. The doors of the lead cruiser flew open. 2 officers stepped out into the deluge. They were wearing heavy yellow rain slickers, their hands resting instinctively on their utility belts. Their eyes swept the scene, instantly taking in the multi-million-dollar wreckage of the supercar and the massive rusted grille of the freight truck. Then, their flashlights snapped toward the side of the Lamborghini. The twin beams of harsh white light illuminated Sarah. She was still kneeling in the puddle, a black woman in frayed, working-class clothes, her hand pressed against the window of a billionaire's vehicle. To the officers, the narrative was instantly, stereotypically clear. A commercial driver had recklessly destroyed an ultra-luxury car and was now harassing the passengers inside. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." The lead officer barked, his voice amplified by a megaphone, dripping with authoritative aggression. "I said step away from the car right now and keep your hands where I can see them." Sarah flinched. The blinding lights hit her face, forcing her to squint. The lullaby died in her throat. The brief, miraculous peace she had created for Chloe evaporated. The brutal reality of her situation came rushing back with terrifying speed. She was at fault, she had destroyed the car. And the police were here to take her away. Sarah slowly pulled her hand away from the glass. She looked at Chloe, offering the little girl one last, tragic, apologetic smile, before she heavily pushed herself up from the wet asphalt. She turned to face the officers, raising her calloused hands in the air, surrendering entirely to the destruction of her life. "Sir, are you Julian Vance?" the second officer asked, quickly approaching Julian. The officer recognized him. Julian was a high-profile figure in Los Angeles. The cop's tone was immediately deferential, respectful. "Are you all right, Mr. Vance? Did this driver attempt to flee or assault you?" Julian stood paralyzed for a fraction of a second. He looked at the officer. He looked at the handcuffs rattling on the cop's belt. Then, he looked at Sarah. She was standing in the headlights, shivering uncontrollably, her eyes cast down to the flooded pavement, waiting for Julian to deliver the final, killing blow to her son's future. She didn't even have the energy left to beg. Julian's chest tightened. The guilt inside him crystallized into something entirely different. It turned into absolute, uncompromising resolve. He had spent 5 years failing to find her. He had spent the last 10 minutes failing to be a decent human being. He was not going to fail her now. "Officer," Julian said. His voice was no longer the cruel, razor-sharp whisper of a ruthless CEO. It was the loud, commanding, and unshakable baritone of a man who was about to rewrite reality itself. Julian stepped forward, deliberately placing himself directly between the blinding police flashlights and Sarah Washington's exhausted, trembling silhouette. "Turn off the flashlights," Julian Vance ordered. The command didn't carry the petulant, entitled annoyance of a rich man inconvenienced by the authorities. It was delivered with the absolute, vibrating authority of a man who owned the very ground they were standing on. The lead LAPD officer blinked, momentarily confused by the hostility coming from the victim. He reluctantly lowered his heavy maglite, plunging Sarah back into the merciful, rain-swept shadows. "Mr. Vance," the officer started, his voice crackling over the storm. "We received your 911 call. You stated there was a collision. From the point of impact, it's clear this commercial vehicle failed to yield and rear-ended Your eyes are deceiving you, officer," Julian interrupted, his voice echoing like a crack of thunder. He didn't even look back at his destroyed $500,000 supercar. He kept his eyes locked on the cops, standing squarely between them and Sarah. There was no failure to yield on her part. Sarah, still standing with her calloused hands half raised in surrender, felt her heart violently skip a beat. She stared at the broad back of Julian's soaked suit jacket. Her exhausted, sleep-deprived brain struggled to process the words coming out of his mouth. "Sir?" the second officer asked, frowning as he pulled out a waterproof notepad. "She hit the back of your car. The physics are pretty straightforward." "I cut her off," Julian lied smoothly, his tone so terrifyingly convincing that it left no room for debate. "I was distracted. I merged into her lane illegally, ignoring the solid line, and I slammed on my brakes. My tires are high-performance slicks and they hydroplaned. She did absolutely everything in her power to stop, but I gave her zero clearance. The accident is 100% my fault." The intersection went dead silent, save for the relentless drumming of the rain. Sarah's mouth parted in absolute shock. The man who just 10 minutes ago had promised to strip her license, sue her into oblivion, and let her son die, was now standing in front of armed police officers, committing insurance fraud, and taking the entirety of the blame onto his own shoulders. "Mr. Vance, if you admit fault, your insurance," the lead officer began, trailing off as he realized how ridiculous the sentence sounded when directed at a man worth $12 billion. "My insurance will handle the damage to my vehicle, and my legal team will be contacting her parent company tomorrow to fully compensate them for the damage to the Peterbilt's bumper," Julian stated flatly. "There will be no citations issued tonight, no breathalyzers, no arrests. The only thing I need from the LAPD is to block the intersection until the tow trucks clear my car out of this woman's way. Am I understood?" The two officers exchanged a loaded glance. When a billionaire takes the blame, the paperwork miraculously disappears. "Understood, Mr. Vance," the lead officer finally nodded, turning off his body cam. "We'll secure the perimeter." As the cops walked away to set up, Julian slowly turned around to face Sarah. Sarah's arms fell limply to her sides. The freezing rain soaked through her clothes, but she was entirely numb to the cold. She looked at Julian, her dark, soulful eyes wide with a mixture of profound relief and utter, paralyzing confusion. "Why?" Sarah whispered, her voice cracking, barely audible over the rain. "Why did you do that? You had me. You had the rope right around my neck. Why did you let me go?" Julian didn't answer immediately. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. And then, the titan of Silicon Valley, a man who shook hands with presidents and commanded boardrooms with an iron fist, something he had never done in his entire life. Julian Vance dropped to his knees. He knelt right there on the flooded, filthy asphalt, the muddy water splashing up against his tailored trousers, mixing with the shattered glass of his ruined Lamborghini. He didn't care about the mud. He didn't care about the cold. He looked up at the exhausted, broken black woman standing above him, and his eyes filled with thick, burning tears. "Because," Julian choked out, his voice completely shattering, "the river is wide, the water is cold. But Mama's right here, and you're brave and bold." Sarah physically recoiled. A shockwave ripped through her entire body. Her breath hitched violently in her chest. She stared down at the billionaire, her mind violently rewinding the tape of her life, tearing through years of grinding poverty and sleepless nights, until it slammed directly into a memory from 5 years ago. The dust, the smoke, the collapsed ceiling, the tiny, terrifyingly small hand gripping her reflective vest in the pitch black. The tunnel. Sarah gasped, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. "I looked for you," Julian wept, the tears streaming down his face, completely stripping away the last remnants of his arrogance. He pressed his hands against the wet pavement, bowing his head in profound, agonizing shame. For 5 years I turned this city upside down looking for the woman who crawled into that hell to save my baby. I wanted to give you the world, and tonight, you were right in front of me, and I looked at you and I treated you like dirt." Sarah stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You begged me for your son's life," Julian sobbed, the guilt crushing his chest. "You begged me and I turned my back. I am so sorry, I am so deeply sorry. You are the greatest soul I have ever encountered, and I am a monster." Sarah looked from the weeping billionaire kneeling in the puddles, over to the crushed Lamborghini. The jammed passenger door had finally been forced open from the inside. Chloe stood in the rain, wearing her oversized pink raincoat. She wasn't screaming anymore. The panic attack was entirely gone. She looked past her father, her eyes locking directly onto Sarah. "The lady in the dark," Chloe whispered. The little girl didn't hesitate. She ran across the flooded street, her small boots splashing through the puddles, and she threw her arms entirely around Sarah's waist, burying her face into the cold, wet denim of Sarah's jacket. The touch completely broke the dam inside Sarah's soul. The 36 hours of exhaustion, the terrifying fear of losing Leo, the absolute, crushing weight of the world she had been carrying alone for 3 years. It all shattered. Sarah fell to her knees in the water, wrapping her strong, calloused arms around the little girl, pulling her tight against her chest, and she wept. She cried to the heavens, the sound of visceral, beautiful release of pain and gratitude. Julian crawled forward in the mud and wrapped his arms around both of them. There, in the middle of a chaotic Los Angeles intersection, surrounded by shattered carbon fiber and the flashing lights of police cruisers, the billionaire, the truck driver, and the little girl held onto each other as the winter storm finally began to break. The rhythmic, steady beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor was the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard in her life. It wasn't the frantic, blaring alarm of a failing machine. It was the strong, steady cadence of a beautifully repaired, perfectly functioning little heart. Sarah sat in the plush leather recliner next to the hospital bed. The sun was streaming through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the VIP pediatric recovery suite, casting a warm golden glow across the room. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing the soft curls on Leo's forehead. His breathing was deep and even. The terrifying, translucent paleness of his skin was gone, replaced by a healthy, vibrant warmth. The surgery had been a complete, unprecedented success. "You did it, my brave boy," Sarah whispered, a tear of pure joy slipping down her cheek. "Mama told you she'd fix it." A soft knock at the heavy oak door broke the silence. The door opened and Julian Vance stepped into the room. He was wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit, but the cold, calculating aura of the tech billionaire was entirely gone. His face was soft, his eyes radiating a profound, quiet peace. He was holding a large, thick manila envelope and something small tucked inside his palm. "How is our boy doing today?" Julian asked softly, walking over to the foot of the bed. "The doctors said he's breaking records," Sarah smiled, wiping the tear from her face. "They're talking about discharging him by next Tuesday, Julian. I don't even know how to begin to thank you. The surgeons, this private suite, the bill must be astronomical." "Sarah, please," Julian gently interrupted, holding up a hand. "I told you, you are never to mention a hospital bill, a rent payment, or a grocery receipt ever again for the rest of your natural life." He stepped closer and held out his hand. He placed the small object he had been holding onto the tray table next to her. It was the Polaroid of Leo. Julian had retrieved it from the muddy floorboard of the Peterbilt. He had taken it to a restoration specialist, having it carefully cleaned, preserved, and placed inside a beautiful sterling silver frame. Sarah let out a soft gasp, picking up the frame, pressing it to her chest. "I have something else for you," Julian said, his tone shifting into something more formal but laced with deep respect. He handed her the thick manila envelope. Sarah hesitated, then slowly unwound the string and pulled out the stack of heavy, watermarked legal documents. She scanned the first page, her eyes widened. The legal jargon was dense, but the bold headers were impossible to misunderstand. "Deed of transfer, full ownership, Washington Freight and Logistics." "Julian, what is this?" Sarah breathed, her hands beginning to tremble. "When I bought out the trucking company you worked for 3 days ago, I did a full audit," Julian explained, pulling up a chair and sitting across from her. "They were exploiting you, Sarah. They were forcing you into illegal 36-hour hazard runs just to pay for your child's medical bills while they skimmed the profits. They are currently being dismantled by my legal team." He pointed to the papers in her lap. "But the fleet of trucks, the warehouses, the distribution contracts. I kept those, Julian continued, a proud smile forming on his lips. And as of this morning they belong to you. Me? Sarah choked, shaking her head in disbelief. Julian, I'm a driver, I can't run a company, I don't have a degree. I don't know the first thing about being a CEO. You have a PhD in survival, Sarah, Julian said, his eyes locking onto hers with absolute unshakable faith. You managed to keep your son alive on a trucker's salary in one of the most expensive cities on earth. You crawled into a collapsing tunnel to save a stranger's child. You possess more leadership, grit, and integrity in your pinky finger than every single executive sitting on my board of directors. You are going to be a brilliant CEO. Sarah stared at the papers. It wasn't just money, it was power. It was generational wealth. It was the absolute guarantee that Leo would never, ever have to know the crushing weight of poverty that had nearly destroyed her. There's one more thing, Julian added, leaning back in his chair. You know, the insurance company tried to total that Peterbilt 389 you were driving. They wanted to send it to the scrapyard. Given how hard I hit you, I'm surprised there was anything left of it. Sarah chuckled wetly, the relief making her lightheaded. I bought it from the scrapyard, Julian said. Sarah looked up, confused. Why? The axle was cracked, the grille was destroyed. It's a piece of junk. Julian smiled, a deep, soulful expression that completely transformed his face. I had my crew tow it back to my estate in Malibu, Julian explained quietly. I had them place it right in the center of my climate-controlled garage. Right next to the brand-new Lamborghini my assistant bought to replace the crushed one. Sarah frowned. Julian, you put a wrecked, rusted 18-wheeler in a garage full of supercars. I did, Julian nodded. Because I needed a monument. Every single morning, before I go to work, before I make a single decision that affects the lives of thousands of people, I walk down to that garage. I look at the Lamborghini, and I remind myself of what wealth looks like. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. And then I look at the smashed, rusted bumper of your Peterbilt, and I remind myself of what grace looks like. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the man sitting in front of her. The arrogant executioner in the storm was entirely gone. In his place was a brother, a protector. A man whose soul had been completely rebuilt by the power of a mother's lullaby. On the bed beside them, little Leo stirred. He slowly opened his bright, clear eyes, looking around the sunlit room until he found his mother. Mama? Leo murmured, his voice soft but lacking the terrifying wheeze that used to accompany his every word. Sarah immediately leaned over, kissing his warm forehead. I'm right here, baby boy, Mama's right here. Leo looked past her, noticing Julian sitting in the chair. He offered the billionaire a weak but genuine gap-toothed smile. Are we going home soon? Leo asked. Sarah looked down at the legal documents in her lap. She looked at the sterling silver frame. She looked at Julian, who gave her a single, reassuring nod. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Washington didn't feel the crushing weight of the world on her shoulders. The storm had finally passed, and the sun was shining brighter than it ever had before. Yes, baby, Sarah smiled, the tears of absolute joy falling freely now. We're going home, and we're never going to be cold again.